Hi, and welcome to The Lamp in the Library. I'm Graham.
I'm Kim.
And today we're going to be talking about works in translation, and specifically the power that the translator has to introduce a work to an entire new audience. And also the responsibility that that translator has to the original author and the original work.
Yes.
So there have been some really high-profile translations, works in translation recently. I'm thinking about The Vegetarian by Han Kang, which was first published in Korea in 2007, but not given an English translation until 2015. And then it went on to win the Man Booker Prize in 2016, and it became this international translation sensation because of the translation into English and other languages. And I guess we have to thank Deborah Smith for the translating work here. And it just goes to show that introducing a work of literature to an entirely new audience is, a great thing about, translating. It widens the range of that work of literature.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that we have to be truly grateful for translations happening. It's thanks to works being kept and translated from the ancient world going forward that we have been able to evolve scientifically and mathematically and in a lot of philosophical thought and such. It's a wonderful world of knowledge that's been shared through the art and work of translation. For example, I'm thankful that Dostoevsky's works have been translated, and I know that for myself I wouldn't be able to read Dostoevsky or Tolstoy because I do not read Russian, but thanks to the wonderful work of translators, I'm able to learn from them and experience their novels. I know for this work, I specifically sought out this translation because it even won an award, and it's very well regarded as being a masterful translations of the work, which sometimes brings up an interesting question of, so for instance, I know when I first read Crime and Punishment a long time ago, it was just like the copy I found. I didn't necessarily think much about the translation of it. But, since then I've learned that there is a translation that's very highly respected, and it makes me wonder, I should reread it again because maybe I was missing some of what was to be on offer from the work by reading maybe a translation that wasn't as strong.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's two artists at play when you're talking about works in translation. There's the original author and then there's the translator. And, I only speak one other language besides English, and it's French. And I'm aware that there are certain concepts in the French language in terms, words that are untranslatable. And so necessarily a translator has to make some decisions when translating. Whether it's a word or a concept that doesn't really translate well, and then how do you bring across that idea into another language or another culture? Some really serious decisions have to be made, and I think these issues become more acute when you're talking about poetry. I am a fan of the poet Paul Celan, who writes in German, and there have been many, many translations of his work. He's known as a notoriously cryptic poet, though interesting enough, he did not see himself as such. But I specifically looked for this particular version of his poems because they were translated by Michael Hamburger, and I just liked his translations better than other translations of his work. And I'm actually right now reading this biography of Paul Celan by John Felsteiner, who is also a translator. And this is a really interesting biography because he goes into great detail about his struggles, John Felsteiner, with translating Paul Celan's work from German into English, and how difficult it is and possibly impossible it is to bring the meaning into an entirely different language. And so he takes you kind of through that process, that kind of agonizing process of translating the poetry, because not only are you trying to get the meaning across and the substance of the poem and the essence, but you're also trying to get across the rhythm and sometimes rhyme, and necessarily you have to make a decision, like what's more important, the essence of the work or a really direct translation, or the rhythm of the poem. So some of those things are going to be lost in the translating process. That's just the way it is. So it's really interesting to read this book, how agonizing that process is. And the author himself says, like, maybe it's impossible to translate poetry into another language. Maybe you just, too much of the essence is lost. That's something to keep in mind when you're reading a work in translation, I think.
I mean, that's interesting because, one, I mean, maybe there's like too much of an assumption when you're reading something that's not poetry. So let's just say fiction works, that there is somehow like a universal understanding of people who read the work in the language it's written and understand. So let's say people read Shakespeare in English. That in itself is like a bit of a different English, so it's hard to sometimes get into the flow a bit at first, especially when you're first introduced to it. And then that there's some, like, everyone agrees on the meaning, which is entirely not true. I mean, English departments would fall apart if that was true. They still continue to debate it now. So yeah, it's sort of like there is that interesting layer to it. And then as he says, like with poetry, I mean, it's sort of this, I would imagine when people translate Shakespeare into other language, it must be a lot of those decisions as well, because so much of it is about the rhythm of it. I read The Conference of Birds by the Sufi poet Attar, and I read one translation of it. And what I really admired is that at the beginning, the translator shared how they decided to approach it. And they approached it by really trying to get to the essence and meaning of the work and the poems within it and the parables in it, not the rhythm of it. And there's another translation I've heard that tries to keep some of the rhythm of it. So then I was like, maybe I'll read both so I can get just a bit more of a fuller picture. But I appreciated that they said that, you know that when you were. So that brings us to a bit of a recent discovery for myself that was
a translating controversy.
So I am very much respect him and am interested in Sufi poetry. And so, as I said, I read Attar's A Conference of Birds, and many people are most familiar with Rumi and some of Rumi's works. And I really wanted to read some of the poet Hafez's works because I'd come across his name and learned a bit about him, but I hadn't read his poetry yet. So I bought a copy, which I gifted to someone for Christmas, because this was the copy of translations I could find of Hafez's work. It's probably the most popular one you can find. And after this person loved it and read all of it, actually it was my mom. Hi, Mom. And then I was reading it, and I found out that these aren't actually translations of Hafez's poetries. Later, the translator, I'm not even sure how to, he shared that they were more, he received the words in a dream or a vision of Hafez. Hafez shared them with him. But they're not translations of the texts that we have that were written by Hafez. And I have to say, I was really gutted when I found out. The translations were by Daniel Ladinsky, and they were published by Penguin Compass. And I think it brings up the point that there's a certain faith that I have as a reader that I bring, that the publishing house and the editors and then also the translator, that they're trying to give you an honest translation with their interpretation, but still that it's at the very least an attempt at translating the texts. And I felt really that Penguin Compass need to bear a little bit of responsibility for that, because it says on it translated by, and then it has a pull quote about how wonderful these translations are. And they're not really translations. Yeah. So
in some cases, they're complete fabrications.
Yeah, and the thing that's partly interesting of this too is that, I mean, the reason why, you know, you fall in love with them when you read them, and some of them I really think are probably the most popular that English speaking people would come across because they're shared on things like Pinterest and Instagram, is because they're beautiful and they do have some, you know, wonderful insights into the spiritual life and mystical insights and such, that really the author, since, like, why didn't he just put his name to them? He shouldn't have put Hafez's name to them. I mean, he could say that they were inspired by, he could say the story of how he found the words, but I don't think it was proper to say they were translations. And I found this and I shared it with Graham because I was looking up to see if one of the poems that I really loved, like, oh, I wonder, like, is it considered the best translation? And I came across a scholar from Duke University who wrote this article sharing that he often has to, unfortunately, tell people, like, sorry, that poem you love is fake, Hafez, because people contact him because they want to say it in their wedding ceremonies and for, like, really special occasions in their lives. And, you know, it's kind of leaves you just, I don't even know, like, you feel kind of lied to almost, but then I just have to remember that the words, I'll attribute them to this man, not Hafez, and now I'm trying to find a well-respected translation of Hafez's actual work. And I just want to mention quickly too that I think that it's really important to highlight, like, Penguin Compass should highlight this more, because Rumi, for example, he's really popular, and things within the Sufi tradition, like, they get kind of popular in secular culture, but they tend to try to secularize them a bit more, and not share as much of the traditions in the faith that they came from, which is something that has already, you know, I've found to be a little bit upsetting about the way that sometimes Rumi is shared. So it's important to highlight how that's an ongoing issue, and then to have these works where this man puts Hafez's name to them, but they aren't translations of his work, I feel is really wrong.
Yeah, I think it gets to the essence of the responsibility that the translator has to the original author. Like, whether you're, you know, wholesale making up poetry or, you know, receiving poetry from a dream, whatever you want to say, in either way, it's not the original text, right? Or you're changing the essence of the work, you know, in the example of Rumi you gave, where you're kind of secularizing something that is deeply religious, just because perhaps you think that it will resonate more with a secular Western audience. Well, that is fundamentally changing some of that poetry. And does that happen in a lot of translations, where you have a work that's in another culture, and to make that culture palatable to, say, an English-speaking or a Western audience, you're making some major changes? I mean, I'm sure that does happen, and I do believe that there is a responsibility on the part of the translator, and of course a responsibility on the part of the publisher to make sure that that translation is somehow faithful to the original author and the original text.
Yeah, and at the very, very least, actually translating written text.
So let's talk about a couple of, I think, really good, inspiring examples. So we kind of badmouthed Penguin there, but I want to say that the New York Review of Books Classics has done a really great initiative in recent years in taking kind of obscure texts in other languages and translating them and introducing them to a new generation and a new English-speaking audience. For example, this is Hill by Jean Giono, originally published in France in 1929, and it was not translated until quite recently, 2016, by Paul April. And very thankful that this was done, because I really enjoyed this work.
Yeah, and just from also New York Review Classic Books is, you know, they made sure to get this wonderful piece of literature the door out by providing a translation, and it's such a remarkable piece of literature. I'm so happy that they did it, and that I was able to experience it, because it was originally written in Hungarian. So So we just wanted to highlight how wonderful it is that works in translation exist and continue to exist. It's a beautiful thing that we are able to learn from people all around the world, all throughout history, thanks to the work of translation and the craftsmanship of the translators. But at the same time, I learned in a very difficult way that you also have to maybe be a little careful sometimes of the sources that you pick, and that publishing companies should take it very seriously, the responsibility that they bear by saying that they're translating a work.
Thanks for watching.
Keep reading.
And keep well. Keep well.
Keep reading.